Good afternoon. It's nice to be here and to come and talk to you about indigenous trees. I'm really just going to give an overview and try and convey to you what inspiration I get from trees with some of my photos as well, because in addition to looking at them from a scientific perspective, I enjoy taking photos of trees. So just some background, which you've already heard. I studied landscape architecture and environmental science. So I have a bit of background in the creative field. I'm currently an environmental assessment practitioner at Zutari, which is a multidisciplinary engineering company. So what I do there from day to day is mostly environmental impact assessments. Developer comes to us with an idea. It might be a factory, it might be an urban development, might be a farm, and we look at what the environmental impacts of that development can be, and the social impacts as well. The environment in South Africa is defined as both the natural environment and the social environment. I've been hiking in the Magaliesberg for more than 25 years, and that's where I met Alan. And I published a little tree guide to Magaliesberg Trees in 2018. That's led me in a different direction. I'm now trying to do starting on a PhD on forests and trees of the Magaliesberg and the Waterberg. And contributing to a book on trees and shrubs of the Waterberg as well. So the first kind of concept is, what is a tree? Everybody has their own idea of what a tree is, and I specifically asked that question here because I had to answer that for myself when I wrote the book. So there's a common definition, which is a woody perennial plant, typically having a single stem or trunk, growing to considerable height. I'm not sure what considerable is, and also lateral branches at some distance from the ground. There's a lot of room for interpretation there. So what's considerable height? We live in South Africa. It's a semi-arid country. So considerable height might be completely different here to Europe or one of the cool, wet areas in the world. What is some distance? And as you'll see, some trees are not woody. That's an aloe. It's a succulent. That's a euphorbia. It's a succulent. So none of these trees have wood. So they're also regarded to be trees in South Africa. They might not be regarded to be trees in the northern hemisphere. That one, the halfmens, which grows in northern Cape, it doesn't branch. So would it comply with these criteria? Probably not, but they're all in the South African list of trees. So my general rule of thumb is, can you sit in its shade? Even if it's this tall, you can probably sit in its shade. But there are a lot of other plants in the Dendrological Society's list of trees, which in my view aren't actually trees. So that's open to interpretation. What is indigenous? Basically, it means it's from here, it developed here, it's evolved here, and it occurs here naturally. So some plants, like a kuyu, for instance, it's naturalized in South Africa, but it originates in East Africa, Kenya, Tanzania area. So that's not indigenous. Pines, oaks, eucalyptuses, they are not indigenous in South Africa. We have about 1,660 trees in the DENSOC list, and about 2,100 in southern Africa, which is an amazing diversity of trees. So why do I look at indigenous trees? Why should we be concerned about whether something is indigenous or exotic? Firstly, natural systems are complex webs. You get plants or organisms that evolve in a particular environment. They interact with other components in the environment. They're particular organisms that live on them, that are dependent on them for their sustenance. So if we take out one component of this web, then you inevitably affect other components in that web. And unfortunately, we as humans are tugging at all these different little components and the interactions between them. And in some cases, these systems are collapsing. So that's why we need to be concerned about this. And the big thing about exotics is somebody sees a nice flower overseas, they bring it here. But they don't bring that plant's natural enemies, the organisms that live on that plant. All plants have natural enemies. They have aphids, they have little bugs that eat them, they have herbivores that eat them, etc., etc. So when you bring that plant here, it comes here without its natural enemies. It doesn't need to compete. It's not put at a disadvantage, which all indigenous organisms here are. They do have to compete. So what inevitably happens is the exotics outcompete the indigenous organisms, and they often push the indigenous organisms to a more vulnerable state. There's a difference between exotic and invasive. So some exotics are not necessarily invasive. They don't take over. An oak tree, for instance, in Stellenbosch, it's not going to conquer the entire landscape. But many of the pine trees, many of the eucalyptuses, they are invasive. The eucalyptus is an absolute water pump. So wherever it takes over a catchment, the water in the stream is probably going to disappear. Some species were brought to South Africa to solve environmental problems. Who knows Cape St. Francis? Okay, so there's that huge beach on the eastern side of that bay, at St. Francis Bay. That beach is disappearing. It's become smaller and smaller over time. Why? Because the source of sand on the other side of the Cape used to bring sand to the beach. What did humans do? They brought in exotic species like the Australian acacias to stabilize the sand. So the sand is no longer moving from east to west across that cape. The same thing happened at Hout Bay in the Western Cape. So the beach is now disappearing. So we've solved an environmental problem, but then created another one. And they have many unintended consequences. People don't think of the consequences when they bring these plants here. Black wattle is an incredibly invasive species, for instance. You can have accelerated erosion, reduced stream flow, and then loss of dependent species. Just as an example, so this is white stinkwood, Celtis africana. This is the scientific name. You don't have to learn that. It's not going to be a test afterwards. This is how all organisms are named. So there's two parts to the name. One is the genus, and the second part is the species. So that occurs across most of South Africa, including here in Pretoria. But then we've also got what's unfortunately sold as Celtis africana, but is actually the Chinese version. It's a Chinese species which is closely related to white stinkwood, but it's not from here. There's where it's from. It's from East Asia. And the problem is that they hybridize, and the indigenous species is losing its genetic integrity. So it's probably going to disappear, particularly in the urban areas where they are frequently planted. Over time. In the natural areas it might be safe, but not in the urban areas. So I'm just putting up two pictures here. I look at trees from a scientific point of view, particularly since I've written the book. I've needed to look at the detail because I need to explain to people, and this is written for, hopefully for lay people so that they can understand. It's not written for botanists. So I needed to look in very detailed level at how you identify a species. What does its bark look like? What does its leaves look like? Are they hairy? What sort of shape are they? How are they arranged on the trunk, on the branches? What color flowers does it have? What do the flowers look like? So I look at it from a scientific perspective, but I also get immense pleasure from trees for aesthetics. So I've been in two pictures that kind of bridge the gap between science and art. So this picture was taken in the late 1960s, early 1970s, as the Apollo astronauts revolved around the moon, and they took a picture of Earth. So it was taken for scientific purposes, but there's immense poetry in that, because for the first time humans could see what our planet looked like from an external perspective. And that changed many people's perception of Earth as our home. That little dot there, I hope you can see that. That's Earth, and that's taken from one of the Voyager spacecraft, which left Earth in 1977. There's a very good video of this by Carl Sagan, who was a phenomenal science communicator. He created the Cosmos series. And I urge you to go and have a look at that video. I'm not going to play it here, but it really does say a lot about, in a very poetic manner, about our role in the cosmos. Okay, so I'm going to take two very dissimilar groups of trees. One is forest trees, which I'm interested in, and the other one is the arid zone survivors, the stuff that grows in the very, very dry areas of the Northern Cape. Just to give you some ideas, and then particularly look at things like the form and pattern of trees, their texture, and how to look at trees differently and see something extraordinary. You can always take a photo of a tree head on in perfect sunlight and it looks good, but it's just a tree. If you look at it differently, you get a different image, and it can convey meaning in a much more interesting way. This is a quotation. Photography is an art of observation. It has little to do with the things you see and everything to do with the way you see them. So what meaning you get from a tree or any other object in the universe depends on how you look at it. So these are some of the forests I'm interested in. The one on the left is from the Magaliesberg near Rustenburg. These forests are interesting in that, well, for me, in that the Magaliesberg is a fairly dry area. It is very shallow soil. It's quartzite, so it degrades into sand, which is no nutritive value at all. And yet you find these very deep kloofs in the Magaliesberg, and there you find these forests, which are essentially relict. So we have a fairly dry climate currently. But these forests have survived over millions of years in that particular area because the conditions there are right for them. They shouldn't actually be here if you look at the broader landscape, and yet they are there. You can see on the left there's a very tall tree standing up with a white stem, and that's what forest trees typically do. They grow up towards the light because there's a lot of competition for light. Then there's another one on the right-hand side, which is in the Waterberg. So interestingly, why this forest is there, everything else to this side and on this side is grassland. Why that forest is there, you can see at the top there's a scar on the cliff face. So what happened there is there was immense rockfall. Rocks came down over the slope and created fire protection. All these trees, they compete with fire, so if there's too much fire they can't grow and they just get killed. So the huge rocks that came down created little niches where there's protection from fire, and so this forest developed there. So where do these forests occur? Well, you can see on the right-hand side there's the escarpment, the dark green areas. That's where most of the forests occur. I'm more interested in the ones that are marked in yellow. There's the Magaliesberg, sort of a line going from Pretoria all the way past Rustenburg, and then there's the Waterberg. And both of these systems have forests that are both relic forests. They're surviving from a previous climatic condition. That's one of the most spectacular trees, the Cape chestnut. It's a huge tree, as you can see on the right, and in midsummer it just explodes into these with these pink balls of flowers. This is one of the iconic trees for me of the forests of the Magaliesberg. It's called African almond. If you take the leaves and you crush them, then it actually smells like almond. It has cultural value in that it's used very intensively for muti, for traditional medicine. This is one of the few areas in this part of the country where it's still safe, because these kloofs are inaccessible and they don't have public access. But unfortunately, its bark is stripped, and in many areas they are under threat. It's in the almond and apricot and peach family. So it's called, the scientific name is Prunus africana. All the other fruits that I've mentioned are also in the same family, but the fruits are very small. Here's another one of the forest trees, red ironwood, Ochna holstii. Many of these, like this one, occur all the way in a belt up the east coast of Africa, up to Tanzania and Kenya in the mountainous areas. I've actually seen them on Mount Kenya as well. And then another one, quinine tree. So many years ago, before there was malaria medication, people extracted quinine from this tree and drank it together with G&T to try and prevent malaria. And this one only occurs in the kloof forests. My other interest is in the arid zone survivors. You'll see what they look like in a minute, but essentially these are trees that really eke out an existence under the most horrible conditions. There's very little rainfall. There can be years without rainfall. There was until fairly recently, there was a drought of about 7 years in the Richtersveld, which these trees had to deal with. And to me, this one of the few scientifically accurate quotations from Jurassic Park. Everything else in those movies needs to be taken with a pinch of salt, because the species didn't look at all like they portrayed. This is one of the few scientifically accurate sayings from that movie. Life finds a way. So where there is a niche to fill, organisms will evolve to fit that niche. They will adapt over time in order to survive. So human artifacts, they disappear over time because it's so harsh. There's incredible wind, there's a lot of sand that blows around. And this part of the country gets, on average, 50 millimeters of rain per year. So some years they can be 0, some years they can be 200 millimeters, but it's really very, very dry. And yet the trees remain. So that's where it is, where we are now. There it's against the, where the Orange River ends up in the Atlantic Ocean. So I've been there a few times over the past 3 years. This is one of the iconic trees of that area. It's called Witgat or shepherd's tree. It's one of the few evergreen trees you will find in that area. Their roots have been measured to be up to about 60 meters underground. There's a cave somewhere in the Northern Cape where they found roots, and it was around 60 meters underground. So they are incredible survivors. They look for water where you would think there's no water. And very valuable for stock as well. They normally have this, you see on the left-hand side, they have this line where stock graze up to, where they can reach, particularly the goats. Is one of the characters of the Richtersveld National Park, one that's grown up against the rock. So in the foreground here is where there's a ephemeral stream, so once in a few years water comes down, and this one has grown up against the rocks, so it's got its feet in the water, and then it kind of drapes itself over the rock, and even holding some rocks there between its appendages. There's another one, the same tree, but from north of the Waterberg. An interesting story I've read is the one by Ursula Le Guin, a very good science fiction and fantasy writer. And it just takes your mind from your human existence to a different perspective. She writes the story from the perspective of a tree that's standing next to a road. These are some of my favorite sculptural trees, the quiver trees. They grow to about 4 or 5 meters tall. They're essentially as big aloes. Interestingly, you can see there's a number of trees that have died here. So even with their phenomenal drought resistance, there are some droughts that they couldn't get through. As I said, there was a 7-year drought in that area. So this area where I took these pictures is called Kokerboom Kloof. It's named after these trees. But there's an immense number of them that have died, and some scientists think they are actually migrating south. So they were in the north, where it's too dry, they're disappearing, and they're slowly migrating to the Western Cape. Some more examples of them. And then another area of the Northern Cape, much further inland in the Bushman land, they're actually thriving. So there's a large number of seedlings here and small immature trees as well. Maybe just having a look at these two pictures. I took them into the sun, so general rule of photography, don't look into the sun, but once you start breaking the rules, then you get interesting things happening. These are some of its relatives, the maidenhair quiver tree on the left, and then the statesmanly-like giant quiver tree, Aloedendron pilansi. It's just mind-bogglingly big for a dry area like that, but incredibly rare. There's probably just a few hundred of them in the wild, and they are also under threat of disappearing. Probably with climate change, it won't last very long either. This is an even dry area, so near the coast, if you remember the map, you get a lot of mist coming in from the ocean. and even cold fronts every now and then. This is on the inland side, so you get the coastal plain, you get mountains, which act as a barrier to the movement of moisture. Then on the other side of the mountains, on the eastern side, it's even drier and very hot. It can go up to 40, 45 degrees. This is in the bottom of the Orange River Valley. And you get these trees thriving. Similar environment, you get the ebony guarri. You can see here, it's in the ebony family. It's got this incredibly dense, dark wood, and that's what ebony from of piano keys was made from long ago. And I just love the textures. You know, as I said when I started with the book, you need to look at what sets a species or a tree apart. So it's things like this, the thorny stem of the halfmens, the stem of the quakerboom. The legend about these trees is that Nama people were distributed around southern Namibia from way back, and then around about the 18th, 19th centuries there were a number of wars that drove them south across the Orange River, away from the land that they knew, and as they looked back towards their homeland on the northern side of the river, as they fled from the wars, some of the gods took pity on them and created the halfmens, because the halfmens' top of the stem always faces north, so they're always looking back towards their homeland. And there's some other interesting textures. Even in death you can find beauty. This is a dead tree which has been eaten by termites, but I just love those patterns. There's the paperbark false thorn, which just has these paper-like bark peeling off from it, and then that's just an anonymous piece of dead wood on the left. Again, the quiver trees, I'm just in love with their stems and the colors and the textures. This is also in that incredibly dry, hot environment of the lower Orange River. And then I look for form and pattern in these trees. This is the foliage of wild syringa, Berkia africana, and that's it on the right when it doesn't have leaves in the middle of winter. You can be forgiven for thinking this is the Serengeti. That's in Gachtwane Mountain Reserve near Rustenburg, where you get these trees with the parasol-like crowns. Just some more examples. Euphorbia cooperi, the bushveld candelabra. This one has the spines that always fork, Carissa bispinosa. That's on the back of the leaf of this silver wild pear. And then the zigzag pattern on that thorny elm. Looking at trees a bit differently, so this is taken up from on a quiver tree which had a few stems that divided from fairly low down. And things don't always need to be in focus, so for me the primary subject of the photo was that red mountain at close to sunset. So that's in focus, but the tree is out of focus. That's the giant quiver tree on the left, and then again the quiver trees in Quakerboom Kloof, and looking directly into the sun. So that just gives a bit of a different feel to the photo. You don't necessarily have to take a photo that focuses on, what a tree normally looks like. So you can still see the one on the left is a mopane tree because it has that very characteristic M shape to its leaves. And this one you can still see is a Kirkia acuminata, white syringa, from the fruits and from the forms of the leaves. What I've been doing recently for the update of this book is to take detailed photos of the leaves of trees, the Magaliesberg, focusing on hairiness of the leaves, the felty appearance of that one on the left, etc. And this, I think, can be art in itself. It doesn't need to be only a botanical illustration. Some of these are still in flower, the coral trees. This is poisonous, but it's beautiful, I think. And ironically, this is called geneesblaar or healing leaf trees. So the leaves, if put on a wound, helps it recover, but the berries are poisonous. That's Notsung, Haleria lucida. And then I love the form of these pods. It's just amazing what variety you get. These are all related to each other. They're all thorn trees. But the diversity to me is spectacular. Thank you very much. You can see some more of my photos there on my Instagram. Let's hear your questions.